Hi, and welcome to this video on identifier names. And in particular, we're really just going to look at some rules that we need to follow when creating identifier names and some conventions as well. So let's start with the fact that identifier names are case sensitive. In other words, my var with that lowercase v, my var with this uppercase v, or ham with a lowercase h, or ham with an uppercase h, these are all different identifiers. So identifiers are case sensitive. So you could write, one variable as ham, one variable as ham with a capital H, and you could use both of those in your code as separate identifiers. Really not recommended that you do so, at least not with variables. There is a case where this might actually be useful when dealing with classes, but generally not something you should do. It can be pretty confusing if somebody's reading your code. So identifiers must follow certain rules, and they should follow certain conventions. And let's take a look at what those are. Let's start with the musts first. So they must start with an underscore or a letter, A through Z or capital A through Z. Now, this is actually a little stricter than reality, because you can use other characters beside A through Z and A through Z, but you're going to be a little bit careful about which ones you use. It gets a little more complicated. You can use also Unicode characters. Well, not that these aren't Unicode characters as well, but I'm sticking to the ASCII set, basically. So be careful with that. The easiest is just to say we'll stick through A through Z for the letters. So they must start with an underscore or a letter, and then they can be followed by any number of underscores, letters, or digits. So really the thing here is that you cannot start an identifier with a digit. Okay, so don't try that, that won't work. So for example, var, my var, index1, index underscore 1 are all legal names. Underscore var is legal as well. Double underscore or dunder var is also legal, as is dunder lt dunder. That's also a legal identifier name. Now I've highlighted these in a different color, and I'll explain that in a minute, but these kind of forms of variable names by convention have a specific meaning attached to them. So the other thing too is that identifiers cannot be reserved words. Then what are the reserved words? Well, none, true, false, and or not, if, else, if. You get the idea. Basically the keywords that you use to program in Python, right? Def, lambda, return, in, is, that we've seen before, try, except, all these are the reserved words. And as of our current version of Python, that's it for now. So there's not a whole lot to remember, but don't use those as identifier names. So let's get to the conventions. So let's take a look at what those conventions were, the ones that I highlighted. So if you have a single underscore in front of your identifier name, let's say you create a variable in a module and you name it underscore my underscore var. Because it starts with a single underscore, it is a convention that is used to indicate that this is an internal or a private object. There is no concept of private really in Python. Everything's public. So basically we're saying, hey, I want to indicate to anyone looking at my code or anyone using my code that they really shouldn't mess around with this variable. So I'm going to give it an underscore, as the first character. So that is really just a convention. Now what happens though is that if you run, let's say, from module import star, and this underscore my var is inside this module, then it will not import it. So the Python interpreter looks at that and says, okay, you probably mean this to be a private object, so it doesn't import it. Now that doesn't mean you can't access it. You can still access it. You can't import it this way, but there are other ways to access it. Okay, let's look at the double underscore. Now the double underscore is used for something called name mangling that we'll look at in detail when we do the object-oriented section. And name mangling basically changes your variable name in a very set way that can be useful for inheritance chains. If you have the same name, the same, let's say, attribute, let's say you do a property in a class, and you have the same attribute in a chain of classes, then how do you differentiate which is which? And this is where the name mangling comes in. And so when you want that to happen, you use this dunder in front of your property name, for example. And we'll see that in a lot more detail. And the last one is the one that starts and ends with a double underscore. So dunder, my underscore var dunder. That has a very specific thing. These are really system-defined names. So Python kind of reserves its naming convention in this way for certain things. And it has a special meaning to the interpreter, which means don't invent them. In other words, don't go and create your own variables that start and end with a double underscore. Just stick to the ones that are predefined by Python. Now, what are they? Well, there's a slew of them, and we'll see a lot of them throughout this course. But for example, you have the init method, to initialize a class. Well, that's the double underscore init double underscore function. And then when you create a new class, it will call that particular function. It's going to look for that function. Now the same thing happens. Let's say you have two objects, x and y, that are instances of, let's say some custom class that you've written, and you want to compare them. You want to say x less than y. Then what's going to happen is that the Python interpreter is actually going to run this underscore underscore lt underscore underscore method that it expects to find in this object, and then pass it the object y. So this operator here actually gets evaluated by using this expression over here. And again, Python will look specifically for this method name when it finds less than. So that's why these are system defined. Don't invent some. You never know what could happen in future versions of Python. Maybe, whatever you decided to use gets used, in the Python standard later, and then there's going to be a conflict between the two potentially. Okay. So other naming conventions, and this is just a very, very small excerpt of the PEP 8 style guide. If you want to look it up, I really strongly suggest that you read it. It's not that long. It's a very interesting read, actually. And it's called PEP 8. Just do a Google search for PEP 8 or Python PEP 8, and you'll get it, and I'll show you the link in a few minutes. So this is how we name different things, like packages. So packages should be short names, all lowercase names, and preferably no underscores. So for example, you might create a package called utilities, right? Note, everything is lowercase, single word, and no underscores. That's the preferred style for naming packages. For modules, we also want short, all lowercase names, but they can have underscores. So for example, db underscore utils would be fine, as would be db utils in one word as well. Really only start using the underscores if you really need it to differentiate the words maybe in your module. Classes. Now classes is different. The convention there is to use cap words or upper camel case, which means that all the words are linked together. There are no underscores, but the beginning of each word is an uppercase letter, including the first letter of the variable. Functions, well, functions should be lowercase, and the words can be separated by underscores, which is called snake case. Right? So for example, open account. So this might be a method in your bank account class called open account. Variables should be lowercase, words separated by underscores, snake case, same as functions. So basically we follow the same convention for naming variables as we do for naming functions. So for example, account underscore ID. Constants are all uppercase, and the words are separated by underscores. So for example, minimum annual percentage rate, min underscore APR, would be a valid constant name. Now obviously you don't have to follow those conventions. You can follow your own conventions. You also may want to follow conventions, especially if it's, let's say, an external interface that you're providing to, to other people, and it may need to conform to what they're used to, in which case that's fine. There's nothing wrong with breaking away from conventions as long as you try and remain consistent within your own code. But these are best practices, and they've been fairly well thought out, and so it's really, I think, recommended to read that style guide, or at least skim through it and see what the main points are. So you can find it at this link over here. But again, the easiest, just do a search for PEP 8 and you will find that link to there. There's lots of other things that they mention in that. In particular, this quote by Emerson, "Foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." And that's kind of what they start off with. So it's a guide, it's a style guide. It doesn't mean that you have to follow it, and you don't have to follow it all the time without thinking. Sometimes you want to break away from your convention for some reason or other. That's perfectly fine. The main goal really with all this is to make your code readable, and by following these guides is you make your code standardized in such a way that another Python developer that's used to that guide will understand, without having to go and look into your code in detail, that something written this way is a constant. Something written this way is a class. These could be, function names or variable names, that's fine. But it helps to really kind of understand how the code sometimes is structured. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.